Hi, I'm Tony. Welcome to So Lounge. Today I'm going to teach you how to sew a yoke into a shirtwaist dress. So Lounge is the place for beginners to learn to sew one pattern at a time. Be sure to click like and subscribe to my channel so you never miss a stitch. Today we are going to be working with McCall's 8031, which is the shirtwaist dress. And we've previously used this pattern to learn how to transfer marks from the patterns to the fabric, and we have also sewed some patch pockets. So we're continuing with this dress today, and we are going to be sewing the yoke. Now, the yoke is the back panel that's going to connect the front panels with the shoulders and then with the back of the dress. So it's its own little piece, and we're going to start out by taking a look at the pattern instructions. So let's go in for a closer look. What do you do? You're so naughty. If you look at the back of the pattern envelope where they have the illustrations of the different design options, you can see there is a horizontal line going between the shoulder seams below the collar. That is the yoke. So that's what it looks like in the drawing. That is basically what it's going to look like once we sew it. And it is used to connect the front of the dress to the back panel of the dress, and it's going to give a little bit more of a fitted look through the shoulders. Now we are starting with instruction number 15 on the pattern. We're going to sew a pleat to get started. Then we are going to attach the yoke and put in a couple of stitch lines, do a little bit of trimming, and then we are going to sew the shoulder seams together. We are starting with piece number 4, so unpin your pattern piece if you still have that connected. And just to put this into context, this is the piece that we cut on the fold. So you'll be unfolding it. And then when we did the marking, we marked the boxes for the pleat in addition to the small dots and the large dots. Now, to make a pleat, it's really not complicated. We're going to be taking the small dot, folding it so that it lines up with the big dot, and then we want that whole dotted line to be all lined up, and then we're going to put in a pin and press. So let's go in for a closer look. So these are the markings to make the pleat, and if you look back at the pattern piece of number 4 up at the top where we're on the same line up here, we have the box, and we're going to be taking this small dot and folding it towards the long dot, and we want this line to be lined up with this line. So that's why we drew in all of the lines so that we can fold along this line and then fold it over to make the pleat. So it's pretty easy. It's not hard once you kind of understand what you're doing and you fold it in the right direction, because we want the pleat to be on the outside of the yoke, which means we want it to have like little pieces going like that, and then we're going to sew the yoke here. So once you get it folded, put in a pin, and then we are going to repeat the process on the other side. So we're just going to fold along that dashed line where the small dot is, or the small circle is, and then we are just going to fold it over to match it along the dotted line that ends with the big dot or the big circle, whatever you like to call it. So I'm just going to put in a second pin in there. And actually, if we look at the instructions, we are going to go baste this pleat in place, then we're going to go press it, then we'll attach the yoke. So I'm at the sewing machine, and we are going to do some basting to just hold this pleat in place. Now, because we're just doing the pleat, we do not have to do the entire top edge. We're just going to do a little bit before the pleat and across the pleat, and make sure that your sewing machine is set to a basting stitch, which is going to be the longest stitch on your machine. And then we want to sew the basting inside of the seam line. So because Clementine is all about being involved in this today. Get down. Come on, get down. Because our seam allowances are going to be sewn at 5/8 of an inch, I'm going to put the basting in at 1/4 of an inch. That way it'll just be inside the seam. We don't have to worry about it. Once we do some more stitching later, it'll be inside that seam allowance and we don't have to worry about it. So just get everything lined up. Let's go in for a closer look. So I have the top edge of my fabric lined up with the edge of my presser foot, and on my machine that is 1/4 of an inch. So just adjust your machine accordingly so that your stitch line will be about 1/4 of an inch from that top raw edge. And then I'm starting my basting about 1/2 inch from the actual pleat to just get it started. So I'm going to roll in my needle, and then I'm going to pull out that first pin while I hold this pleat in place, and I'm just going to baste across that top edge. And then I'm going to pull this pin out. I'm going to still keep this all lined up with my finger, and then continue to baste about 1/2 inch past the pleat. And let's pull this out. And you can see we now have our pleat basted in place. And we're going to head to the ironing board. So I'm at the ironing board, and I have my iron set for the heat setting that is appropriate for the fiber content of my fabric. This fabric is 100% cotton, so I have my iron set to cotton, and I have it on heavy steam. Now, when we press this pleat, we want to press the sides down as well, just about 1.5 inches from that top raw edge, because we want to make sure that that catches in the yoke once we add that seam, and we want it to stay nice and flat. That's the whole point of pressing, to keep everything lined up, keep it all nice and flat while we are doing the sewing process. So you can just go in there, add a little bit of steam, whatever's appropriate for your fiber content of your fabric, let it cool because it is hot, and then we are going to attach the yoke. Moving on to pattern instruction number 16, we are going to pin the right side of the yoke to the right side of the back panel. Now, this is piece number 5. If you still have your pattern piece attached to it, just remove that. And with this fabric, it's that kind of weird brown that looks the same from both sides, but the right side has more of a slub in it, so I can figure this out. Right side, and then we are going to pin to the right side. That means that you want the folded part of the pleat to be attached to the yoke. Now we're going to match the yoke up at the notches. So get those lined up. And then we're just going to grab a couple of pins to hold that in place. And once my notches are matched, then I'm going to go back in and pin it across the top edge, which we are going to sew at 5/8 of an inch. So once you have the sides, you can go get the pleat lined up across the top. Just make sure everything is nice and neat. And you do want to make sure that you pin that pleat so that as you're sewing that seam, it does not get folded over. That's one of the reasons we pressed it, but putting a pin in there will also help. And let's head back to the sewing machine. So I'm back at the sewing machine. First thing you need to do is make sure you have taken your machine off of a basting stitch and put it back to your regular length stitch. I always sew at 2.5, that's just my personal preference, but you can sew at whatever stitch length you want. I wouldn't go any smaller than a 2 in case you have to rip things out. Now we are going to be sewing at 5/8 of an inch, but that is the standard commercial pattern seam allowance width, and I am going to use this handy magnetic seam gauge to line up on my 5/8 inch mark so that I can stay lined up and everything looks good. Next, I'm going to move my fabric against that magnetic seam gauge. Let's go in for a closer look. I have my fabric lined up. I'm going to make sure that it's against that 5/8 inch mark. And if you don't have a magnetic seam gauge, you can just find the 5/8 inch mark on your sewing machine and then line up your fabric along that. I'm going to use this magnetic seam gauge because it makes my life a little bit easier. I'm going to lower my presser foot. And I am starting a little bit ahead of the edge of the fabric. That prevents thread snarl. So sometimes you have that little ball of thread underneath your fabric when you start out at a seam. If you start a little bit ahead, and then if you roll your needle down and start with your needle down, that is a good way to prevent that. I'm going to take a couple of stitches forward, And then I'm just gonna go back, hit that reverse seam, and I'm gonna go back to closer to the edge. And then I'm gonna start sewing forward again, removing each pin as I get to it. And we are just sewing in the first seam to attach the yoke to the back of the dress. And now we are just coming to that edge of the other side, and I'm also going to do a back stitch there because later once we mess with the armhole, we don't want this seam pulling out or unraveling. And since my fabric is a little bit difficult, I want to make sure that doesn't happen. Once you get to the edge, just lift up your needle and your presser foot. You can go in and see that it's all in there. Next, we are going to go back in, and the instructions say that we need to sew 1/4 of an inch from the line we just sewed inside of the seam line. My presser foot is 1/4 of an inch, so I'm just going to line up the left edge of that presser foot with the stitch line we just sewed, and I am going to start sewing again. We're just repeating the exact same process. And I'm not going to back stitch because we've already got a back stitch in there. This is more secure stitching because we are going to trim. We're just finishing the second stitch line. I'm going to lift my needle, lift my presser foot, cut off those thread tails. And now, as you can see, we've got our 2 stitch lines sewn in, and our yoke is connected to the back of the dress. We're still on step number 16, but the next thing we want to do is trim close to the stitch line we just sewed. So that second stitch line, we're going to go in, we're going to trim close to that. The reason we sewed that in there was to help reinforce. I'm not trimming super close because this fabric is ravelly, and the last thing I want to do is to have it come apart. But I'm leaving about 1/8 of an inch above that stitch line. Let's go in for a closer look. So you can see I have started to trim this edge, and I'm just taking a tiny bit off. I'm still leaving about 1/8 of an inch in there, and I'm just going to continue down the length of that seam to just reduce some of that bulk, and that is going to also help reduce the bulk that is here in the pleat. Just continue across, cutting. Be careful you don't go crazy and cut across that stitch line. Just take your time. There's no reason to rush any of this. And then once you finish, we are going to open this up, and we are going to press the seam towards the yoke. Back at the ironing board, and I am pressing that seam towards the top of the yoke. That's what the pattern instructions tell us to do, so that's what we're going to do. That's going to reduce the bulk a little bit later once we go put in the sleeves. Set your iron accordingly and go in and press that up towards the shoulder seams, towards the top of the yoke. And then give it a minute to cool, and then once it's done, I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to press from the other side as well, just so I have a really nice crease in there, and it's going to just be nice and sharp, and then it'll just be set in the fabric, so I don't have to worry about that later. This is totally optional. You do not have to go back in and iron from the other side. I'm just going to do that. Make sure you don't iron over your pleat if this is a step you are doing, or press over your pleat, since we're not actually ironing, we're just pressing, and you don't want to press it out. But that'll just give you a nice crisp line from the outside, and we're going to head back to the sewing machine and sew the shoulders together to connect the front and the back pieces of the dress. Next step is to pin the shoulders of the front panel to the back yoke of the dress. So we've got the whole back panel put together, the yoke at the top. We're going to be pinning these shoulder seams, so it's going to be the notch on the yoke to the notch on the shoulder of the front panel. So get your notches all lined up and put in a pin, and make sure you do it for both sides. And we are just going to sew in these shoulder seams real quick. And then we will have completed the entire yoke section. So once again, the pattern does not specify, so we are going to be sewing at the standard 5/8 inch seam line. I'm just going to get this all nice and smooth and flat. It's like a lot of little pieces. It's like these long flaps that are hanging down the front. So get everything situated on your table or your sewing surface as best as you can to keep it all smooth and lying flat. And then we want to just focus on that shoulder seam. Your machine should still be set to your regular length sewing stitch if you haven't done anything else. So just get that all lined up, still sewing at 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to roll down my needle. I'm going to start stitching, and then I'm going to back stitch and go forward again. Taking out that pin. And then just back stitching at the neckline. So lift that up. We are going to repeat on the other side and then head back to the cutting table. Now you know how to sew a yoke. So that is what it's going to look like once we have finished. The side seams are still going to be open. Next steps on the pattern, and this is pattern instruction steps 18 through 22, are putting a side seam pocket into the side seam and then finishing the side seam. Now, I ran out of fabric, so I didn't have any space for pockets. So if you want to make the pockets, you can head over to this video, and it's the exact same steps for the pocket in this dress. Both dresses have the exact same pocket, and you can follow along and get that inseam pocket sewn in neat and tidy. And then stay tuned, because we will be coming back with making a collar and then attaching it, and then we will continue with the rest of the dress, putting in that front facing, making some buttonholes, putting in the sleeve. All the rest of the parts to this dress will be coming up soon, so stay tuned. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to click like and subscribe to my channel so you never miss a stitch. And if you've got questions but no one to answer them, head on over to Let's Talk Sewing for Beginners, hosted by So Lounge. It's an interactive Facebook group where you can ask all the questions you want, and I will get you some answers. Until we meet again, happy sewing!